This begins my multi-part series on my theory on the origin of consciousness and the meaning of life. To get at the answer of those questions, I'm going to first take you through the inverse, the origin of life and the meaning of consciousness. We'll start with the former, the origin of life. The notion of life originated when clusters of molecules assembled into the trio of capacities of forming a membrane converting energy into motion and subdividing into mutated clones. If you don't believe it's possible for this to happen by chance, see Martin Hanchak's TED Talk on the subject. Here's the most remarkable part of the video where a non-living membrane-encapsulated collection of molecules uses an energy source to move, mutate, and subdivide, demonstrating the most basic characteristics of life. So in the beginning, some of these jiggling molecular clusters randomly did smart things like move towards sources of energy, and some randomly did dumb things like fail to recognize the figurative sandwich before them. Some subdivided like rabbits, others swore themselves to celibacy. The molecular clusters that stayed alive longer and subdivided faster would become more numerous in population and would consume a greater share of the finite energy in their region. This process of random mutation and non-random natural selection at the molecular level should logically lead to an increase in the average level of complexity and sophistication in the survival and reproduction strategies of the most primitive, vaguely lifelike cells. Version 1 finds a source of energy and stays there till it dies. Version 100 keeps it moving to find new sources of energy and absolutely sluts it up, giving birth every Tuesday. For the purpose of this series, I'm going to need you to do two things. First, pretend that you yourself are not a living thing, but rather an external observer of what we now call life, originating from non-life and evolving over the course of 4.5 billion years till today. Second, I need you to give me your best guess as to how many years it takes on average for life to get exactly 1% more complex through directionless mutation and natural selection alone. Be conservative. Err on the side of that shit being slow. So, what do you think? 1 day, 1 year, 10,000 years, 100,000 years? You tell me. For part 2, I wish to convince you that it's very believable that human life is the direct descendant of accidentally self-replicating matter. Remember from the previous parts that life can originate and become more complex on its own, and for the purpose of this series, you are an external observer, not a living thing. In part 1.5, I asked you to estimate how long it takes life to get 1% more complex. My own guess is 1 million years, but feel free to substitute that with your own estimate. What we can do with this is estimate how much more complex life would be after certain intervals of time. In 10 million years, per my assumption, life would have the chance to get 1% more complex 10 times, making it 1.01 to the power 10, or 10.5% more complex. So, you, the external observer, notice the most remotely lifelike properties in some mineral-rich clay at the bottom of the ocean. You wouldn't call it living, just like you wouldn't call the self-replicating molecules I showed you in part 1 living. You write this off as interesting and check back in 100 million years. Those weird molecules are still there, but not much has changed. It's just 1.01 to the power 100, or 2.7 times more complex. Still not alive in any traditional sense. You travel for a bit and come back a billion years after the origin of life. Now life is 1.01 to the power 1000, or 20,000 times more complex. That's kind of cool, but it's still the most primitive single cell. You take a billion-year nap and come back. Now it's 1.01 to the power 2000, or 440 million times more complex. These are some fairly sophisticated single cells, and they just recently discovered photosynthesis, so now they can exist toward the surface of the ocean. You take another billion-year-long cigarette break and check back in. Now life is 1.01 to the power 3000 times more complex, 9 trillion times more complex. There's a party going on because just yesterday, cells figured out how to band together and become multicellular. You still know this isn't actually living, it's just exponentiation of complexity going a little crazy and getting faster in absolute terms, 1% at a time. You show up another billion years later, taking us to 500 million years ago. Now life is 1.01 to the power 4000, or 200 quadrillion times more complex. Now all of a sudden there's primitive sea life and land insects. You figure that makes sense given the insanely magnified level of complexity that exponentiation brings. You fully understand that this is the same phenomenon of non-living molecular clusters becoming more advanced in their complexity through random mutation and natural selection alone. In that sense, they aren't categorically different, they're just quantitatively more complex. Over time, these organisms began to detect the presence of light waves, then to distinguish between frequencies of light as color, to make out shapes based on objects' reflections of light, then to be able to visually detect food, sort of a primitive vision. Some beings figured out how to distinguish between frequencies of air pressure waves, what we now call hearing. And other senses followed suit through random mutation, leading to 1% increased complexity every million years. You go do some errands and come back 500 million years later to the present day. Now life is 1.01 to the power 4500 times more complex, or 28 quintillion times more complex than the earliest form of life. Now the place is unrecognizable. There are humans and skyscrapers, factory farms and modern agriculture. A novel coronavirus is sweeping the planet. Sounds about right, you think, given the magnitude of 28 quintillion. That's the same ratio as the ratio of weight between Mount Everest and a tiny grain of sand. These molecular clusters sure have gotten sophisticated. You have to remind yourself that they're not actually alive or in possession of free will. They're still slaves to highly evolved deterministic processes that are highly effective at staying alive, finding energy, and reproducing. You notice they have some weird electrochemical signals firing their cranium, coordinating their senses. You decide to listen in, and you're shocked. These overgrown single-celled organisms are interpreting these signals as what they call thoughts. Moreover, they think they have the ability to override their deterministic internal processes in their obviously incorrect theory of free will. You, an observer of life's increasing complexity at a steady rate of 1% every million years for 4.5 billion years now, you know better. At no point did free will develop. What would that even mean at the atomic or molecular level for free will to exist? These modern life forms are not defying any laws of physics. They are, again, just the product of very tiny exponential growth in non-living clusters of molecules that stumbled into some of the most basic properties of life. As you continue listening in to the so-called thoughts of these human creatures, you find that many of them wonder about what life is, what its meaning is, where consciousness came from, who their creator is. You, of course, have the answer to all those questions. You've been watching them since the very beginning. So for the first time, you decide to introduce yourself. You descend from the heavens and ask humanity if they would like to know the meaning of life. At first, all you get is tepid applause, so like a hacky performer, you say, "I can't hear you!" And then, recognizing what they're being offered, all of humanity erupts into cheers. They really, really want to know. "My children," you begin, "the meaning of life is that life can originate from non-living clumps of clay. Given the evolution from non-life to basic life to complex life, how could there be any more meaning than that? Life is an accidental configuration of matter. There's no reason for existence being a thing. The origin of consciousness is the gradual increase in complexity of survival strategies over 4.5 billion years. Free will is an illusion that evolution duped you into believing. Consciousness itself is not really a thing. Why do you think it's basically impossible to define? Why do you have a first-person perspective, you ask? Because something that is tens of quintillion times more complex than its predecessors will have every evolutionarily advantageous trick in the book. Finally, I acknowledge you do have a creator, and I'd like to introduce her to you. As it turns out, she is a conceptual trio: random mutation, exponentiation, and time.